Welcome back. Mars might be the next giant leap for mankind, but there's a great deal of space out there and a number of nations willing to explore it all. As John Zarello reports, exploring the final frontier is becoming a truly global effort.
Today, the space race is, well, maybe a brisk walk. And the three major spacefaring nations, the United States, China, and Russia, appear at this point headed in different directions. So, where are the big three going? Since the shuttle Atlantis landed back at the Kennedy Space Center 5 years ago, the U.S. has not had the capability to put humans in space. You heard me right.
Engines at maximum thrust.
And liftoff.
The U.S. relies on the Russians at a cost of $65 million a seat to carry its astronauts to and from the International Space Station. That could change by 2018 when private companies, Boeing and SpaceX, should have vehicles ready to ferry astronauts. With these station missions turned over to the private companies, NASA, the U.S. space agency, is now concentrating on building a massive new rocket and a spacecraft, Orion, to carry astronauts first to an asteroid rendezvous and then Mars in the 2030s. Some U.S. partners would like to see a moon mission as a stepping stone to Mars, but NASA rarely uses the moon and Mars in the same sentence. China, on the other hand, seems destined and determined to send humans to the moon. Methodically and in measured steps, China is building toward a permanent presence in space. The Tiangong 2 Space Lab, with improved living quarters and life support, will be home to 2 Chinese astronauts conducting experiments for at least 30 days. A mission to put a lander on the moon's dark side is in the works for 2018, and a permanent space station could be in orbit by the early 2020s. All are precursors to landing its astronauts on the moon. Russia would like to go to the moon too, but the country's struggling economy has forced a tightening of the space budget. Plans for a powerful new moon rocket are delayed, but the Russians are still eyeing a 2030 lunar landing. One unanswered question is whether Russia and the United States will go their separate ways if the International Space Station's mission ends as planned in 2024, or will they continue to play in the same sandbox?
Our guests are back with us, including John in Florida. And why don't I start off things with you, John? Talk to me about Barack Obama and how you see a shift under a new President Donald Trump. I mean, is NASA going to be impacted?
I don't think there's any question there'll be an impact. Whether it's a positive impact or negative is what we really don't know. The president-elect has said that he wants to see NASA a new emphasis on moving outward, on space exploration. He wants to set up a national council that would, in essence, kind of oversee NASA to some degree. So the jury is really still out on what to expect. I think it's going to be very telling. I think Charlie Bolden, who's been NASA administrator, has done a spectacular job. He's a wonderful human being, a good guy, and he knows what he's doing, and was also, of course, a shuttle astronaut. I think that depending on who ends up, if someone replaces Charlie as NASA administrator under the new administration, that will tell us quite a bit about the future direction for NASA over the next 4 years. So at this point, I really don't think anybody can sit there and say, we know exactly where the Trump administration is going to place NASA as far as in pecking order for dollars.
And Tom, let me pick up off there. If Donald Trump were to give you a phone call and ask you about space exploration and the economic value, what would you say to him?
Well, I think it's, first of all, fundamental to the country's future to have the cutting-edge technology that spaceflight involves. So the exploration missions that you launch help you solve problems back here on Earth, too. But there is some real economic value in this space between the Earth and the Moon. And I agree with our friends in China and Europe, and Jean-Jacques and Yang, that the Moon is a viable economic destination. There are ice deposits on the Moon that we can use to create rocket propellant. We can sell that rocket propellant to space agencies around the world as a private venture. We can enable those companies to produce the oxygen and drinking water that a human would need at an outpost on the Moon. And that same rocket fuel that we produce from the moon or a nearby asteroid could be used to get us to Mars eventually, lowering the cost of that venture. And then there's solar energy. We could harvest the endless, continual energy of the sun, beam it down to the Earth's power grids in the next 50 years, and create a significant way to get away from fossil fuels, supplement nuclear energy and renewables by using space-based solar power. So, exploiting the resources, the natural resources that are out there between the Earth and the Moon and on the Moon and the asteroids is a big way to go. And I think that's a probable shift in emphasis that the Trump administration will bring to NASA.
And Jean-Jacques, I saw you nodding your head as Tom was talking, but we see so many governments now saying cut, 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 austerity being a key word, and we're seeing a lot of that in Europe. Any concerns about cutbacks in terms of spending on something as important as space?
Well, actually, at the moment, I would not say that Europe is cutting back on its space budgets. The budget, the overall budget of the European Space Agency continues to increase. So first, because there were further new commitments from its member states when they gathered earlier this month, 11 billion, which is not nothing. It also comes on top on the continued commitment of the European Union to develop its flagship programs, so namely Galileo and Copernicus for navigation and remote sensing. So we're not really cutting back on budgets. And definitely there is a strong conviction in Europe that space exploration is going to continue. But as I said, it should, I would say, take shape in the framework of a big international collaboration. And at the moment, I would say that Europe has a long tradition of cooperation, in particular with the United States, and we would like to know more about the intentions and the objectives of the US there, and see what role we could play in there. But once again, our vision, and I think that this vision is broadly shared among the European member states, is that the next destination is the moon, and that a moon village, a permanent settlement on the surface of the moon, should be the way to go. Now, lowering the price is also an objective in order to deal with the constraints on the public budgets, but lowering the price, I think is a way to achieve that is certainly to rely more extensively on the private actors that could contribute at very effective conditions to the servicing and refueling of, I would say, public exploratory missions.
Professor Yang, we're hearing a lot about collaboration, cooperation. Of course, China entered into an agreement with the UN to give really pretty much open up the door for cooperation, give developing countries more of a chance to access space. Talk to me about the importance of this step on the part of China.
Well, you know that China developed its space program according to its own need, and also the international cooperation is one important part of it. In China's future space station, because it will not only be a national laboratory in space, but also will bring more chances for China to cooperate with other countries in scientific research. And of course, as our other guests have mentioned, for the future human missions to the moon or to the Mars, if we can have international cooperation together, we can greatly reduce the cost. On the other hand, because the commercial space flight is also very in a very booming status in China, so it also brings more chance for China Aerospace, either from the government or other organizations, to cooperate with other countries, either from the industry or from the universities or other organizations. So in the future, I believe it will be an inevitable trend for all these nations to work together and have more international cooperation together. And these kind of cooperations will not only reduce the cost, but also make it more fast and possible for the access of human being in the moon surface. I mean, make a permanent human base like the moon village raised by Mr. Yang Kohler. And also in the future, I believe the human missions to Mars will not only be a temporary visit, but also we will build a future Martian base, maybe in 2030s or in 2040s. But of course, that will be an international cooperation.
International cooperation, we just heard this, Tom. I want to go back to you. In 2011, the United States passed this bill that outlaws NASA working with China. Some feel that this is really kind of short-sighted. You were talking about working with cosmonauts. In many ways, up in space, the divisions that we see here on Earth are gone. I mean, you can work alongside somebody where there may be differences down here on Earth. Talk to me about that move. Do you think it's short-sighted? Is that something that should be removed? Should there be more international cooperation?
I hope for more cooperation with China in the future. The history of working with Russia, our Cold War adversary, took 25 years to overcome those suspicions and the adversarial relationship. And it was very small steps at first in the early 1990s, where now the two space establishments, Russia and the U.S., work very smoothly together. I think in the case of China, it's going to take a similar learning process where first we do scientific collaboration with robotic spacecraft, joint instrument sharing on spacecraft of both nations, and then that will move towards a more open relationship where we can get insight into the safety standards, for example, that the Chinese use to build their piloted spaceships. Just as we had to understand how the Russians built their Soyuz rocket and capsule, we have to understand the design standards and be satisfied with their processes. And it's tough when China has a secret military-run space program on the human side. I hope those barriers will come down with the scientific cooperation first, then human collaboration.
Professor Yang, let me throw it back in your direction. Do you think it's likely that at some point we'll see these walls come tumbling down? There'll be more cooperation between China and the United States when it comes to space exploration?
Actually speaking, many of my friends from NASA agree with me that we should cooperate together. It is only the U.S. Congress that make it impossible. So in the future, I believe that the policy will be changed sooner or later. So in the future, I think both nations should prepare for this kind of cooperation. You know that we do have some cooperation in 1990s for China provide the launch services and for the U.S. Companies for launching their satellites. But it is a pity that they stopped several years, scores of years before. But in the future, I believe the human space flight and the deep space missions will be the most possible field for both nations to work together, because China already has a very close cooperation relationship with Europe and Russia. So it has already been a good example for the future cooperation between China and the U.S.
Gentlemen, thanks so much. It's been an enlightening conversation. Really appreciate your cooperation and being here.